Imagine this. You wake up in a world centuries behind ours. There's no heater, no blanket, no soft bed, just cold stone walls, a dirt floor, and a fire that died hours ago. In a quiet village nestled in the forgotten woods of Eldegolan, the night had already claimed its place. Snow tapped lightly against the wooden shutters, and the wind whistled through the cracks of every cottage. Inside one of these humble homes, young Micah Duval, a blacksmith's apprentice, curled into a tight ball beside his younger sister Amara and their grandmother Niella. No one undressed. They wore the same woolen tunics and boots they had labored in all day. The room was no larger than a stable, and in truth it was both. A goat named Tilda slept in one corner, her breath rising in soft white clouds. The floor was packed dirt. No beds, just straw bundles tied in worn linen sacks. The warmth came from bodies huddled close not from fire, which had already burned out. This was normal. In Elderglan, and across the lands of old, sleep was not comfort. It was an act of endurance. For the people of that age, a peaceful night's rest was rare. The bitter cold crept in before sunset and never left until dawn. Walls didn't stop. The wind, blankets were scraps, pillows were boots. The night wasn't quiet either. It breathed with the sound of chickens shuffling, the crackle of dying embers, the occasional cough, and sometimes, just sometimes, the soft prayer of someone, hoping to make it to morning. This was not a time of sleep. It was a time of survival, a test of the human body and of the soul in the heart of the freezing night. Micah's eyes fluttered open. It was neither morning nor still night in the way we know it today. It was the in-between, strange silent hour that people of Eldegolan simply called the soul's time. His grandmother Niella always said, "This is when the world listens." She wasn't wrong. In the Middle Ages, sleep didn't happen in one stretch. The villagers followed what they believed was nature's rhythm: first sleep, then the vigil, then second sleep. The first sleep started just after sunset, as soon as the day's chores ended and the hearth's glow dimmed. It was the deepest, rest lasting 3 to 4 hours. Then came the break. Micah sat up quietly, trying not to wake Amara. The coals still whispered faintly in the hearth. He pulled on his cloak and tiptoed to stir them, placing a twig in the ash to bring back a flicker of warmth. In the shadows, old Niella was already awake, whispering a prayer with her hands clutched over her chest. In this sacred pause between dreams, the villagers often reflected, tended to small chores, or simply listened to the night. Some prayed. Some wept quietly over lost loved ones. Others, like Micah, just watched the fire and thought. It was said the veil between this world and the next was thinnest, now, and many believed that God was closest during these hours. Sometimes husbands and wives shared their quietest moments here beneath worn cloaks, far from the eyes of others. In homes where privacy didn't exist, this was the only hour for intimacy and vulnerability. After about an hour or two, the body called again. Micah laid back down beside his sister and grandmother, pulling the coarse cloth over his shoulders. He closed his eyes and surrendered to what they called second sleep, the gentler sleep that carried them until the first rooster's crow. For the people of Eldegolan, this two-part rhythm wasn't strange. It was simply how the body worked when untouched by lanterns, streetlights, or factory bells. They didn't fight it. They followed it. Like they followed the rising sun or the frost that settled in their boots each morning. Modern scholars would one day call this Bophosic sleep. But for Micah, for Amara, and for all who lived in the cold silence of medieval winters, it was simply night. As the second sleep deepened, the small cottage of Elderglan fell into a fragile stillness. But this wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence built from exhaustion, frost, and shared breath. There were no bedrooms in Micah's world, not for his family, not for anyone in their village, except perhaps the Baron's household up the hill. For ordinary folk like them, one room was all there was, a room that served as kitchen, workshop, nursery, and sleeping quarters, all at once. The Duval family lived, cooked, worked, and slept in the same smoky square of space. A large bench ran along one wall, made from uneven planks hammered together by Micah's father before he passed. That's where Nyella slept, closer to the fire. Micah and Amara lay beside her on a thick sack of straw stitched with old rags and canvas. It smelled of sweat, soot, and chamomile, a blend their mother once used to keep insects away. In the far corner, under a slanted shelf, Tilda the goat let out a sleepy grunt. Nearby, 2 chickens nested in an old wooden crate padded with dry moss. This wasn't strange. In fact, it was smart. The animals' warmth helped the family survive the bitter nights. Their breath mixed with the steam of sleeping bodies, forming a kind of living insulation. There was no changing into pajamas, no bed sheets to turn down. The Duvals slept in the same woolen clothes they wore all days, sometimes still damp from snow or sweat. Boots were only loosened, not removed. The floor beneath them was packed earth, cold and cracked, and often turned damp before sunrise. Micah had once removed his boots during a frost and woken up unable to feel his toes. Hey! He never repeated that mistake. Privacy was a word they didn't know. Even newlywed couples and elder galans slept behind a thin curtain or under a shared cloak within inches of their siblings or elders. But no one complained. There was comfort in the closeness. Sleep wasn't just personal, it was communal, a body-to-body defense against the cold. The dark and the silence of the long winter night, and so, wrapped in old tunics, resting there. Heads on sacks or boots, with goats and children and aging hands all gathered near the fire's fading heat, they drifted one breath, one heartbeat at a time into what sleep they could find by midnight. The small cottage in Elder Gallen was wrapped in darkness and breath. Not just the breath of Micah, Amara, and Nyella, but of animals, of damp cloth, of life pressed tightly together beneath the cloak of winter. There were no walls separating one sleeper from another, no locked doors, no whispered good night. Behind a bedroom door, instead, everyone lay side by side, husband and wife, child and elder. Goat and dog all drawn close to one another like pieces of a single living body. This wasn't a choice. It was the only way to survive. The cold didn't respect space, but warmth came from bodies pressed together. Micah slept with his arm curled protectively around Amara, her small feet tucked into the fold of his tunic. Ellis. Hands were wrapped in a coarse wool shawl, her back pressed against the wall, still radiating the day's fire. Even Tilda, the family goat, was pulled closer when the wind howled too hard. Her belly warmth had saved Amara from freezing during last year's coldest night. No one complained about snoring, creaking joints, or coughs. These were the familiar sounds of survival. The crackling of embers, a whispered prayer, a sudden murmur. From a dreamer, this was the music of the medieval night. Silence was never the goal. Warmth was. There were no real blankets, only patches of cloth, homespun, repaired, inherited. Most of the time they wrapped themselves in old coats or the cloaks they used for travel during the day. Ka's father's cloaks still bore the smell of sweat and leather, but when laid across their bodies, it held the cold at bay just enough. For infants, there were no cradles. They were placed between adults, covered gently, their tiny hands disappearing under layers of cloth. Older children like Micah slept with their feet toward the hearth, wrapped in whatever could be spared, sackcloth, an old woolen dress, or even the dried and crusted cloak their father once wore to the market. And yet, its tangle of limbs and smells, there was an unspoken understanding, kind of bodily literacy, knowing not to elbow Nyella, not to crowd the goat, not to startle. Amara and her sleep, it was chaotic, it was intimate, but it was survival. When the wind pressed against the walls and frost formed at the edges of the cloth that served as a door, the Duval family, and hundreds like them across the kingdom, faced the night not alone. But together sleep in Elder Gallan was not a retreat. It was a defiant act against the cold. A whisper that said, "We will wake again." Far beyond the flickering hearths of Elder Gallan's peasants, atop the snow-covered cliffs of Castle Durnhaven. The wealthy slept behind stone walls, but not always in comfort. The chambers of nobles like Lord Alaric Dern, master of the Highlands, were certainly grander than the thatched huts below. Heavy oak doors, embroidered tapestries, and high beds framed in carved wood filled his halls. But when it came to sleep, even nobility couldn't escape the winter's cruel grip. Alaric's chamber was vast, yet icy. The fire burned in a wide hearth, but heat seldom reached the far walls. Even in the upper rooms, draughts slithered through stone cracks, and candles barely flickered against the cold. For all his status, Lord Alaric still pulled 3 cloaks over himself at night and shared his chamber with others. You see, even among the rich, sleeping alone was a rarity. His wife, Lady Mavia, slept beside him under layers of fur and wool. But beyond the curtains of their canopy bed, the room was not empty. A cousin from the lowlands, a traveling priest, their children, even a maid or two, sometimes a governess. In noble houses, privacy was a luxury even wealth could not always buy. In women's quarters, unmarried sisters, aunts, handmaidens, and young daughters often slept in the same room, sometimes 3 or 4 in a bed. In the men's quarters, knights and squires rested shoulder to shoulder, row after row, like soldiers in a barracks. Even the high walls of the castle could not divide the need for warmth. The idea of personal space was foreign. Sleeping beside others was both custom and necessity. The only boundaries were often drawn by clotha, curtain hung, a blanket raised, a screen folded between bodies. It was less about separation and more about symbolic privacy. Not unlike peasants using a piece of linen to hide newlyweds on their first night, and though lords might afford feather mattresses or imported woolen blankets, dyed deep red or dark blue, their battles with the cold were no less real. Parasites still crept into their sheets. Bats still scuttled through their chambers. The luxury lay not in perfect sleep, but in having a little more protection, thicker walls, richer fabrics, better food to fuel the body's warmth. Yet even here, where nobility was draped in fur and velvet, sleep remained a fragile thing, often interrupted by superstition, illness, or fear. And so, like Micah below in his cottage, Lord Alaric, too, pulled the blankets tighter, hoping the night would pass gently, because in winter's grip, no one, not peasant nor lord, slept entirely at ease, while lords in their towers clutched velvet covers. Back in Elderglan, the Duvals made do with what they had, which wasn't much. Micah's bed was not a bed at all. It was a flattened pile of straw bundled into a sagging canvas sack, patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible. It crackled when he shifted, sharp bits poking through the linen, some stained with soot, some with the scent of chamomile Niella had mixed in to keep the fleas away. They called it a sleeping sack. But it was closer to a nest made of survival. Straw was the most common material. If they were lucky, it was dry. If not, it grew moldy, pressed down by nights of sweat and breath. It was rarely replaced, sometimes just once a season. Life too close to the earth. Those who had a little more added a layer of wool or a hide. The Duvals had one old sheepskin, hardened in spots, but still soft enough to share. Niella often laid it near Amara's legs to protect her. From the worst of the floor's chill, some families, those who lived in slightly better cottages, built raised, wooden platforms called sleepboards. These were logs laid side by side to lift the bedding a few inches off the damp floor. Mika's cousin Tomar lived in such a house, even had a piece of burlap under the boards to block drafts. But most villagers, like the Duvals, slept directly on the ground. In southern villages, people used mats of woven reed. In colder regions, like Elder Geelon, they tried moss, dried leaves, or even bundles of rags tied together. Sometimes, just a shirt rolled up as a pillow and nothing more, and yet no one complained. The body learned. Children were raised on roughness. By the time Micah was 10, he could fall asleep on damp straw and not stir until morning. Comfort was not expected. Warmth was a luxury. Sleep was a result of exhaustion. The Duvals, like many, turned their discomfort into ritual every night. Before lying down, Niella fluffed the straw with a stick. Imara laid out the cloaks. Micah checked for rats in the corners. They shook out the sacks, not because they hoped for freshness, but to dislodge the worst of the damp. In the end, The bed didn't matter as much as the bodies in it. They slept covered in dust, wrapped in cloth older than memory, listening to the wind scratch against the wooden shutters. And yet, despite the cold and the crawl of insects, they slept, because they had no other choice. As the frost thickened against the door, and even the fire turned to glowing cinders, the Duvals pulled whatever they could over their shivering bodies. There were no real blankets. It's only pieces of a life lived hard-stitched together, handed down, made warm by memory. Micah tucked his feet beneath his father's old market cloak, still crusted with traces of past winters. It smelled of damp wool and ash. Amara was swaddled in a patchwork coverlet their mother had sewn before she passed a quilt made of torn skirts, faded tunics, and a strip from Nyela's old wedding shawl. Each patch held a story. Each tear was stitched with love and need. In medieval villages like Elder Glen, blankets weren't bought, they were built. Some families used sacks from grain or flour, turned inside out and filled with straw or rags. Others tied together capes that had grown too thin for travel. A few lucky homes had an heirloom, a sheepskin, unbroken, soft and warm. The Duvals had once toughened with age, but still precious. Vella kept it wrapped around her legs, occasionally, sharing it with the children when the wind howled too loud. When winters grew harsher, they added layers, not quality. Tunics folded twice, cloaks draped over backs, old curtains turned sideways and tucked under chins. It wasn't elegant. It was layered survival. Micah once asked why they didn't just sleep beside the fire. Nyela had smiled, her face creased. Like an old map, because fire burns out. But you, child, warm your sister longer than any flame. In the north, people sometimes used animal hides, goatskin, bearskin, even old wolves' pelts. They were heavy, oily, and carried the sharp scent of fat and fur. But they kept the cold out, especially when shared. In the Duval household, if the cold grew too sharp, they brought Tilda the goat under the covers. Her warmth, though sour, was welcome. During the cruelest nights, the family slept under one large cloth, curled into a living cocoon. Micah on the outside, Amara in the middle, Nyela anchoring the warmth. It didn't matter if they couldn't move. The closeness was the point. If you could feel someone's breath against your shoulder, you had hope of surviving till morning. There was a saying in Elder Glen, winter won't take you if you're not sleeping alone. So they wrapped themselves in memory, in scraps, in skin and sweat, and stitched together prayers. Because a blanket didn't need to be beautiful, it only needed to be enough. In the coldest depths of winter, even the thickest cloak couldn't fight the frost that crawled in through the floor. When breath turned to mist and cloth turned to ice, the Duvals turned to their oldest Elitha stone. It wasn't magic, it was memory. A chunk of earth heated by fire, wrapped in rags, and placed with care beneath straw or at the foot of a bed. They called it Firestone, and in Elder Glen, it was the guardian of warmth. Micah had his favorites, smooth, flat, and dark gray, shaped like a broken plate. He would heat it near the hearth just before bed, rotating it with a stick until it was nearly too hot to touch. Then Nyela would wrap it in burlap, tie it with twine, and slip it beneath the sheepskin or under the crook of his knees. It didn't last long. But for an hour or two, it was everything. Most families in the village did the same. Some used bricks, taken from collapsed ovens, others river stones that held heat better. The wealthy might have had metal foot warmers or coal boxes with velvet linings. But for the Duvals and their neighbors, stone was king. The ritual was passed down from elder to child. Nyela taught Micah how to feel the stone's warmth with the back of his hand, how to avoid burns, how to place it where warmth would travel, up through the core. On the most brutal nights, they used more than one at the feet, another near Amara's side, and a third left near the headboard. Wrapped tightly in an old cloak, in some homes, stones were placed in clay pots and left at the corners of sleeping areas to slowly radiate heat, like a silent sentry against the freeze. During harsh winters, people even took the warm stones to bed, clutched to their chests, trusting in that fading heat to carry them through the dark. In northern regions like theirs, it became a nightly ritual as essential as food. Children knew. The sound of stones rattling against the hearth. Old people warmed their hands over them while spinning thread. Soldiers carried them during winter marches to survive night halts in the woods. Even the sick, too frail to stand, were comforted by a hot stone placed beside their ribs. Stone held no smoke. It needed no wood. It never failed to remember fire. Micah often thought the stone was more reliable than the wind, more faithful than the sun. It didn't speak, but in its heat was a quiet promise. I was warm once. I'll be warm again. And when the embers finally died, and the wind howled louder, and the walls creaked like old bones, the warmth in the stones still lingered, pressed to Amara's chest, keeping her dream alive. In the village of Eldagulin, night never meant undressing. When the fire went out and the cold came crawling in through the earth, the very idea of removing your clothes felt like madness. Micah had never seen anyone in his family undress for sleep, not once. Instead, they layered up tunics over shirts, cloaks over tunics, and boots kept firmly on their feet. Even baby Amara, barely 5, went to bed wearing the same woolen frock and hand-wrapped shoes she wore all day. The Duvals didn't do this out of laziness. They did it because they had no other choice. The floor was made of clay and dirt. At night, it didn't just cool, it sucked the warmth out of your bones. If your feet touched it without leather or wool, the chill would crawl straight into your chest. That's what Nyella always warned. Lose the heat in your feet and you'll wake up coughing. Boots were loosened slightly for comfort, but never removed.
Ow.
Sometimes they doubled as pillows placed under the head with a folded cloth for cushion. But most often, they simply stayed on, worn down, mud-stained, but essential armor against the cold. There were no nightgowns, no sleepwear, no cotton pajamas. The same shirt Micah chopped wood in was the one he slept in. If he had 2 shirts, one for church and one for work, that was considered fortunate. Most had only one, patched at the elbows and crusted with smoke. Clothes were not changed nightly. In fact, they were sometimes worn for weeks, especially in winter. When bathing was dangerous, undressing meant exposing your skin to the air. In a place where water froze in buckets by dawn, that could be fatal. Even the rich didn't sleep bare. Nobles layered themselves in robes or cloaks at night, just like peasants. In monasteries farther north, monks were instructed by Rule 2, keep their work clothes on while sleeping during winter. Warmth, the elder brothers used to say, is holiness when it protects the body from death. And there was something deeply psychological about keeping your clothes on. If you heard a sound, if wolves howled, or a thief crept toward the livestock, or war drums sounded from across the hills, you could leap up already dressed for whatever came. In wartime, soldiers slept in their armor or with their swords tied to their waists. Readiness was not a strategy. It was a necessity. For the Duvals, sleep wasn't a time of relaxation. It was a suspended, guard-a-fragile moment between work and waking, always under the shadow of the next hardship. Micah once asked Nyella if people in the past ever slept naked. She looked at him, eyes wide with amusement and sorrow, and said, "Only fools or the dead." Midnight in Elderglan wasn't silent. It was restless and alive. Micah lay still, pretending to sleep, but his body itched. Something was crawling beneath his collar. Maybe a flea, maybe worse. He clenched his eyes, shut, resisting the urge to scratch. Across the room, he could hear the soft rustling of straw. It wasn't just Amara turning in her sleep. It was rats. The night in medieval villages was never just about cold. It was about what lived in the dark, the small, the hidden, the hungry. Parasites were a part of life. Bedbugs nested in the cracks of wooden benches. Fleas thrived in the seams of old cloaks. Lice made a home in every shirt that had gone weeks without washing. No matter how tightly Nyella tied up their straw bedding, the insects always returned. Even in castles, it was the same. Servants scraped bugs off noblemen's beds with knives. Fleas infested velvet just as easily as sackcloth. Cleanliness wasn't the problem. Survival was in the Duval cottage. Rats were the worst. They chewed through grain sacks. They crept across the floor at night, drawn to crumbs, to warmth, to any sign of food. Nyala had placed an old tin bowl near the hearth filled with vinegar and ash, hoping the smell would drive them away. But Micah knew better. He'd seen a rat sniff past it just the week before. Some nights they bit. Fingers, toes, even cheeks. Amara had woken once with blood on her lip and tearful eyes. They never found the rat, but the bite stayed. Even worse than the pests was the dampness. The packed earth of their floor grew slick with moisture. It clung. To clothes, it crept up into bones. The straw beneath them often smelled like rot by morning. Even if the night started dry, it never ended that way. To fight this, Nayla would sometimes burn juniper or wormwood before bed. She waved the smoke through the room like a priest with incense, muttering old prayers as it drifted over the straw. It helped for a day or two, but the fleas always returned, and so sleep became a battle. A test. You didn't just lie down and drift off. You fought for sleep, in bursts and fragments, between the scratch of a rat or the sting of a bite. Children cried in the night. Elders coughed themselves awake. And when infection came, rash, fever, or swelling, there was no doctor, just hope and warmth. And the promise that maybe tomorrow night would be quieter, but it rarely was, because in the Middle Ages, the night was never empty. It was crowded with breath, fur, claws, whispers, and fear, and yet the people slept not because it was peaceful, but because they had to, because without rest, even restless, could not rise to survive the next day. The darkness in Elder Glen was not just cold, it was feared as soon as the last ember. Dimmed and the shadows thickened, the world changed. For the Duvalzond, for most villagers across the kingdom, the night didn't simply belong to sleep. It belonged to things unseen. Micah had grown up hearing Nayla's warnings. Don't speak after midnight. Don't whistle near the window. And never ever look outside if you hear your name called in the dark. The people of Eldergalen believed. The veil between worlds thinned after sunset. Spirits wandered, witches rode the skies. The souls of the dead sought warmth. And between the first and second sleep, that strange middle hour around midnight, they believed the devil walked the earth in silence to guard themselves. Every family had rituals. Nayela sprinkled blessed salt along the windowsill. A dried bundle of St. John's wort hung above the door, tied with red thread. Micah wore a small iron charm around his neck, heavy rusted, shaped like a cross. It's not pretty, Nayela told him, but it keeps the shadows back. Some nights, she burned a sprig of juniper, or waved a hot coal around the room in the shape of a circle. And before they closed their eyes, they all whispered the same prayer. Light, protect us. Darkness, pass. Let no spirit cross this hearth. It wasn't just folklore. These beliefs were woven into their sleep. Empty jugs were turned upside down, so no wandering spirit could use them as a home. Cracked mirrors were covered. No bread was left exposed, lest it invite the hungry dead. Even the roosting owl was feared. If it hooted too close, it was said to be a soul calling out a name. And if someone had a nightmare, woke up screaming or gasping, they were given holy water. Or if that wasn't available, a coin pressed into their palm. Some believed the weight of silver could keep a demon from returning. Micah had once woken with deep red scratches on his shoulder. No one had seen him move in his sleep. Nayela didn't say a word. But that night she nailed a small iron nail into the wall beside his bed in the shape of a cross, and slept with one eye open. Even the noble families didn't sleep without protection. Lords hung tapestries with protective runes. Monks slept beneath embroidered cloths marked with Latin verses. And in some places, night watchmen walked from house to house, saying loud prayers, not just to stop thieves, but to chase away what could not be seen. Sleep was not just rest. It was a crossing. A time when the soul wandered, when the body was still and vulnerable. It was a place where fear and faith met under one blanket, and when the cock finally crowed, when light returned to the windows, Nayela always said the same thing. Another night survived, another shadow passed. Sleep, already a fragile thing in Elderglen, came almost impossible in times of war, when the kingdom's borders were threatened and soldiers marched through the valleys. Sleep transformed from a nightly ritual into a desperate luxury, something borrowed, not granted. Micah remembered the winter the king's banners passed through their village. His cousin Jor-El, barely 16, was conscripted. Before leaving, he had said to Micah, "You don't sleep during war, you. Close your eyes and hope no one kills you while you do." And he wasn't wrong. In makeshift camps and blood-stained fields, soldiers slept in their armor, their heads, resting against their shields or the haft of a spear. They did not lie down unless ordered to. Most sat or leaned against walls, rocks, or trees, dozing for moments at a time, never fully surrendering to the dark. In freezing outposts, fire was scarce and warmth came from huddling in clusters, wrapping cloaks around each other, placing smooth stones heated earlier near their chests. But when a cry rang out, a horn, a scream, snap of branches, they were on their feet in seconds, blades drawn. Eyes still blurred with sleep, famine made it worse. When crops failed and barns stood empty, the body could barely rest. The gnawing of an empty stomach pulled villagers from slumber again and again. Sleep while hungry felt like punishment's a quiet ache that stretched across the ribs and whispered, "Wake up, or never wake again." Nyella had lived through 3 famines. She told Micah that in the worst of them, people stopped sleeping. Lying down, sat upright by the hearth, wrapped in whatever cloth they could find, nodding off for minutes at a time. Children cried in their dreams. Old men murmured about feasts that never came. Even in castles, the nobility were not untouched. During long sieges, lords and their men shared chambers, curled on flagstones, swords in hand. The air stank of blood, fear, and rot. Rats gnawed through bags of barley, and men lost fingers to frostbite as they slept. In monasteries, brothers prayed through the night, not just for peace, but for permission to sleep. Records speak of monks passing out mid-psalm, faces hitting wooden pews, exhausted beyond human limits. And yet, amidst all of it, they still tried. They carried bundles of herbs, lavender, chamomile, dried moseed and cloth, and tucked under cloaks. Some warriors whispered lullabies taught to them in childhood, not for peace, but for courage. Because in the dark of war and hunger, to close one's eyes was an act of faith. Faith that they would open again. So when the war drums faded, and the soil thawed, the fields began to breathe green, once more those who survived carried with them a new respect for rest. Not as a right, but as a gift. In Elderglen, when Jor-El returned to winter's later scarred, quiet and older than his years, he didn't speak much. But he told Micah one thing before falling asleep in his old spot by the hearth. Sleep like this. Close to the ones you love, don't take it for granted. Out there, it can be taken from you. Here, it's given. In the world of Eldergland, in countless forgotten villages like its sleep, was never just rest, it was resilience. It was defiance. It was life, wrapped in wool and fear and hope. Micah would grow to understand this. He would remember the countless nights he spent beside Amara and Nyella, not on a bed, but on straw, listening to the crackle of fading embers, the soft cluck of chickens, the distant howl of wind, and sometimes the sound of nothing at all. In that nothing found survival. They didn't have mattresses, they didn't have silence, they didn't even have privacy, but what they had was closeness, the kind that passed warmth from body to body, the kind that taught a child not to flinch at a snore or the brush of a cold foot in the night. They knew the shape of sleep like they knew the shape of work, imperfect, loud, physical, sacred, in the Middle Ages. The night was not a sanctuary, it was a trial. Every night, people prepared for battle, against the cold, against insects, against spirits, against the dampness that crept up from the floor like death itself. Sleep came in bursts, not comfort. It came wrapped in hunger, fear, and prayer. And yet they closed their eyes anyway, because in that pause, no matter how brief, the body gathered strength to face the firewood, frozen soil, the next sickness, the next sorrow. They slept as they lived together, tightly woven. Layered in labor and love, Nyella used to say, Sleep isn't a gift, it's a reward. And in her words lay the truth of a forgotten world. So the next time you pull a blanket over yourself, shut your door and silence your room. Remember this: there were once people who slept in their boots, who used stones as heaters, who whispered prayers to chase away demons, who held each other close not for affection, but for survival. Medieval sleep wasn't peaceful, it was powerful, a quiet resistance, a nightly act of courage, a human heart still beating despite the cold.